One night, a man was camping deep inside a national park in Washington, far from any trail or official campsite. He picked that spot specifically because there should not have been another person for miles. But late one night, he woke up and realized someone else was already there, someone who should not have been able to find him. At first, he thought it was a strange encounter he could shrug off. But 2 days later, almost 15 miles away, he heard the same voice in the dark, and when he saw who it belonged to, he understood that he was not imagining it. Someone had been following him through the forest, step by step, day and night, and he was completely alone. This is what happened. He had driven out near Mount Rainier, parked his car off a dirt road, and hiked deep into the forest. He was not using official campgrounds. He wanted total isolation, so he set up his tent in a clearing surrounded by thick trees. By the time the sun went down, the only sounds were insects and the crackle of his fire. Hours later, in the middle of the night, he woke up without knowing why. There was no movement, no snapping branches, just the kind of silence that makes your stomach tighten. He unzipped his tent a few inches, pointed his flashlight toward the dead fire pit, and froze. A man was sitting on the ground just a few feet from the tent. He was facing the ashes of the fire like he had been staring into it, even though it had been out for hours. He didn't have a backpack, no gear, nothing. Just a regular-looking guy sitting there like he had been waiting. The camper whispered, hey." The man turned his head. The light from the flashlight hit his face, and his eyes went wide like someone had caught him doing something he shouldn't have been doing. Then, without saying a word, he scrambled up and sprinted into the trees. The camper sat frozen in his tent, listening for footsteps, but the forest went silent again. When the sun rose, he convinced himself the guy was probably high or mentally out of it and had wandered close by accident. He tried to enjoy the rest of his trip and put the encounter behind him. 2 days passed. He had traveled 10 to 15 miles in random directions across steep terrain, streams, uneven trails, and places where there were no paths at all. There was no way someone could have tracked him by coincidence. That night, he sat by his new campfire. The woods were quiet, but he kept thinking he heard small movements somewhere behind the trees. At first, he tried to ignore it, but then a voice drifted out of the darkness. "Hey, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" The camper froze. The voice was too close and too calm. He stared into the dark and called back, "What? Who's there?" The voice repeated itself from just outside his line of sight. "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" He didn't think that place even existed in that area. He tried shining his flashlight toward the sound, but the voice snapped, "Aim that away." Something in the tone made him stop. He didn't want to anger whoever was out there. For the next several minutes, the person kept talking, asking random questions, saying things that made no sense, staying hidden just outside the glow of the fire. The camper kept glancing over his shoulder, convinced the voice was getting closer. Finally, he heard a twig snap. He turned his flashlight toward the sound again. The beam landed on a face. It was the same man who had been sitting outside his tent 2 nights before. The camper stood up fast. The man stared at him for a split second, then turned and bolted into the trees again. This time, the camper chased him for a short distance, but the darkness swallowed everything around him and he stopped. Going any farther would get him lost. That was the moment he understood what was happening. The only way that man could possibly end up near him again was if he had followed his exact path for 2 days straight. The next morning, he packed up everything and started hiking towards where he believed his car was. It would take him about 3 days. The entire time he kept looking behind him. He walked, doubled back, took unnecessary turns, hid behind trees, and waited to see if anyone was trailing him. Every sound made him stop. Every shift in the silence made him brace himself. On the first night of hiking out, long after he crawled into his tent, he heard footsteps circling his campsite. Slow, deliberate. He held his breath and waited, too scared to move. When he finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent, the footsteps stopped. No one was there. On the second night, he heard something in the distance. At first, it sounded like an animal. Then it changed. The pitch, the rhythm, the pattern. It sounded like a person trying to imitate an animal, a human voice making howling noises across the darkness. He sat upright in his sleeping bag with his hand over his mouth, praying it wasn't that same man. He didn't sleep until the sun came up. By the third day, his legs were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. When he finally saw the outline of his car through the trees, he said he nearly broke down. The relief hit him so hard he almost cried. He never saw the man again. He never figured out who he was, what he wanted, or how long he had actually been following him. But the fear of feeling hunted stayed with him. He said it was the single most terrifying experience of his entire life. Some stories begin with a place that already feels dangerous, but this one starts somewhere safe, somewhere familiar, a small forest behind a childhood home, the same forest someone explored for 18 years, either alone or with their dad, a place where nothing bad had ever happened, where the biggest threat was slipping on a wet rock or getting your shoe stuck in the mud. This story happened one summer when they came home from university. It was their first time back in a year, and they wanted to revisit the woods they grew up wandering. Their home sat just outside a small town, surrounded by miles of dense forest. A grassy path near the house led toward a narrow stream that eventually joined a river. The river stretched west and fed into a man-made lake. All around these waterways were hills, thick trees, and long stretches of land where you could walk for hours without hearing or seeing anyone. They had a routine for these walks. They followed the grassy path as it slowly curved northwest, away from the stream. After a few miles, the path made a sharp bend west. That was the point where they always cut back into the forest. They knew exactly where to push through dense trees to reconnect with the stream on the other side. From there, they walked north along the water until they hit the river, then turned west and followed it to the lake. The terrain rose and dropped unexpectedly, making it easy for anyone unfamiliar with the woods to get lost. But after 18 years of exploring, they knew every turn. That summer, they went into the forest twice. The first time went wrong in a way they could not explain. The second time almost ended their life. The first trip was early in the morning. The forest felt normal, the air cool and clean. After about an hour, they reached the stream. They knelt by the water and ran their hands through it, listening to the small current rush around the stones. Then they heard it. A bell. Faint at first, coming from the north, as if someone deep in the woods was ringing it again and again. It was too heavy and too clear to be a dog bell. The sound carried through the trees in sharp bursts, ringing with purpose. They listened, confused, and then started moving toward the sound. Their logic was simple. They were heading north anyway, so it was worth seeing what it was. But the bell kept moving away. After 5 minutes, it stopped completely. Nothing in the woods explained it. The stream was too small to drag anything like that. The river was still far. Nothing else made sense except a person, and that thought bothered them more than they wanted to admit. They kept walking. They tried to put the sound out of their mind, until they saw the badger. It was lying on the ground near the stream, dead, recently killed. The head was completely removed, cleanly, like someone had used a knife. The body was still limp, and the wound was packed with wriggling maggots. The smell was faint but noticeable. Whoever killed it had done it recently, and because both they and the bell had been following the same direction, there was a chance the animal had been killed while they were on their way toward it. They looked around. Nothing moved. The trees stood still. The silence felt heavier than before. They left the forest soon after. They could not shake the feeling that something about the bell and the badger was connected. But at home they convinced themselves that it had been a coincidence. Nothing dangerous, just strange. 1 week later, they went back. This time they left around 6 in the evening. The sky looked heavy with rain. They walked the same route as always, reached the stream, cut through the woods, reached the river after about an hour, then decided to turn back because the rain was getting worse. The sun would set around 9, and the forest felt darker than usual under the thick clouds. By the time they began heading back toward the grassy path, the rain was pouring. The sound of it hitting the leaves was so loud that it muffled everything else. They trotted with their head down through one of the more open areas of the forest, trying to move quickly without slipping. Then they collided with something heavy. The smell hit them first. Sweet, sour, rotting, thick in their nose immediately. They stumbled back and looked up at what they had walked into. It was the badger. The same one from a week ago. But now its head had been tied to its front paws with a cord. The entire thing was strung up from a low tree branch, hanging like some heavy, swollen bag. The rain had soaked it, and a greenish fluid dripped from the wound, mixing with the water on the ground. The body swung slightly as the wind picked up, and some of the fluid had splattered across their hair. For a moment they froze. Then they began to shake, brushing their hands through their hair, wiping their face, trying to understand what they were looking at. They had walked the same route to get to the river, which meant someone had strung up that body after they passed it on the way in. Someone knew they would see it on the way back. Someone had been watching. Their breath quickened. They looked around. The trees looked distorted through the rain, the branches heavy with water. Sounds were muffled, just the constant drumming of rain on leaves. They started jogging. They tried to stay calm, but the forest felt wrong. The open areas felt too exposed. The dark areas felt too deep. They were heading southwest toward the grassy path, but the rising panic made the distance feel endless. Then the bell rang. Louder this time. Closer. That same heavy metallic ring cutting through the rain. They pulled their phone from their pocket with shaking hands and called their dad while running. They told him to meet them where the path made its sharp westward turn. That was the closest place they could reach. They told him someone was in the forest. They felt their stomach twist so hard it made them light-hearted. Their breathing turned shallow. Their legs were already tired, and the bell kept ringing, on and off, echoing through the woods in different directions. The rain made it hard to tell how far away the sound was. It felt like it was everywhere. Their mum got on the phone too, yelling that they were already in the car, that their dad was getting out at the bend and heading east into the woods. The caller tried to run faster but kept slipping on wet leaves. They were coughing, gasping, crying, trying to breathe while the rain drowned out everything. Then, behind them, a branch snapped, clear, sharp, human. They whipped their head around. At the far end of the clearing stood a tall figure. The outline was dark against the fading light. The person moved slowly toward them, swinging a bell in front of their stomach, ringing it with a steady rhythm. They could not see the face, only the shape, the posture, the intent. He was looking straight at them. The caller turned and ran. They screamed that they were on the phone with the police. They screamed that their dad could see them. They screamed anything they could think of to keep the man from getting closer. They never looked back again. Their body took over, pushing past exhaustion, splashing through mud and water, slipping and catching themselves again and again. The bell kept ringing behind them, steady and slow. They could barely breathe. Their vision blurred. Their chest hurt. They dropped their bag without realizing it. Their phone felt like the only lifeline they had. Finally, they heard their dad shout their name. The tone of his voice told them he could see them. They sprinted forward and crashed into him. When he grabbed them, they both heard the bell echo one more time from the trees behind them. Their mother heard it through the phone from the car. They ran back to the road and jumped inside. Their mum was gripping the steering wheel, shaking. Their dad looked over his shoulder at the woods as they sped away. The figure never stepped out of the trees, and no one ever found out who that man was or why he was there. Some camping trips stay in your memory because of the scenery. Others stay because of the people. But the trip this family took a few years ago is remembered for a completely different reason. It is the only time they left the woods with more questions than answers, and the only time they wondered if they had unknowingly camped beside a place where someone had disappeared. The man telling this story had spent his entire life in Oregon's forests. He camped, hunted, and backpacked alone for years. He knew the woods around Mount Jefferson better than most people who visited them. He respected the land, understood the animals, and knew what the forest sounded like when it was healthy and alive. It was the place he felt most comfortable, which is why what happened still gives him a shiver years later. He and his family decided to spend a weekend camping north of Mount Jefferson. It was him, his wife, their daughter, and their 2 German shepherds, Guts and Leah. They picked an unofficial spot off a US Forest Service road that formed a natural horseshoe, lined with tall trees and flat ground. It was perfect for the dogs, who needed the privacy because their size tended to intimidate other campers. The family had camped all over Oregon, but this place felt quiet, secluded, and safe. The first night, their daughter wanted to sleep in her own small 2-person tent, right next to theirs. The tents were only a couple of feet apart, and Guts, the fearless male shepherd, slept in her tent to watch over her. The parents stayed awake most of the night, lying in their own tent, listening to sounds that did not feel like normal forest noises. They heard heavy footsteps, the kind that made the ground shift slightly, not scampering, not something small, but something moving with weight behind it. The father had come prepared. He had recently read a news story about a dad in California who had been shot in his tent next to his children, and the thought stuck with him. So he had 2 pistols and a rifle with him. His wife had a pistol as well, and between all of that, plus the dogs, especially Guts, who was known for being fearless, he felt their daughter was safe. Nothing happened that night, other than the footsteps and the uneasy feeling that something was off. He convinced himself it was deer or possibly elk walking by in the dark. The next morning, the family took a walk down the road near their campsite. Only a few hundred feet away, they noticed an old abandoned spur road. The metal posts where a gate had once stood were rusted and covered with vegetation. In the brush, something blue caught the father's eye. Before anyone could react, Guts bolted down the abandoned road. The father's heart started pounding. He thought it was another family camping nearby and that his dog was about to scare someone or get himself shot. He sprinted after him, the others following behind. Guts suddenly stopped about 20 feet down the road. When the father caught up, he realized that there was no one there. No campers, no voices, but there was a campsite, and something was very wrong with it. The family stepped carefully through it, looking around. Every piece of gear had been destroyed, not scattered, not weathered, but violently smashed. A cooler had been crushed flat. A propane tank looked like something heavy had dented it in. A folding table was twisted and broken. Blankets were shredded, and the tent, a nice one from REI, had been torn apart like something with claws had ripped through the fabric. The father stood in the middle of the devastation trying to understand what he was seeing. The gear was still there. Valuable gear. No one abandons items like that unless something forces them to. But there were no footprints, no drag marks, no tire tracks. Just the remains of a campsite that looked like someone left in a panic and something else had finished it off. He tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone left quickly and animals did the rest. But the cooler and the propane tank had been crushed in a way he could not explain. Later that day, back at their own camp, he and his daughter were playing bocce ball near the tents. His wife walked about 70 feet north, to take care of something behind the trees. He could not see her from where he stood. That was when Guts suddenly sprinted toward her, not running for attention or play, but rushing with full speed and sharp focus. The father knew immediately something was wrong. Leah, the other shepherd, stayed glued to their daughter's side with her hair raised straight up. She refused to take the lead position, something she normally did instinctively. The father ran toward his wife. She came jogging back toward him with wide eyes. He pulled his pistol from his holster without hesitation. She told him she had felt every hair on her body rise while she was crouched behind the trees. She was sure someone was watching her. And then she saw Guts running in her direction and decided to move back toward the family. They searched the woods for signs of anything. Broken branches, footprints, disturbed leaves. There was nothing. The forest looked untouched. They decided they would stay one more night since it was too late to pack up. But this time, they would all sleep in the big tent together. Before bed, the father tied a rope around the perimeter of their campsite and hung a small makeshift alarm from it. A mint can filled with coins and keys acted as a warning. Anything that hit the rope would give a metallic jingle. As he tied the last section near a tree next to their tent, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Another rope, old, brown, frayed, dirt-stained, so worn it blended in with the bark. It had been tied at the same height as his rope, about 8 to 10 inches off the ground. A few rusted washers still hung from it. Someone else had made the exact same alarm system. He stared at it and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had spent his entire life in the woods and had never seen a campsite with an alarm rope like that. And here he was tying one next to an older version someone else had left behind. When evening came, he put his wife and daughter in the truck, rolled down the window, and fired an entire magazine from his .45 into the dirt. He wanted anyone listening to know they were armed, that they had 2 German shepherds, and that they were not an easy target. That night, the forest went completely still. No footsteps, no movement. The dogs did not bark, not even once. At dawn, they packed up and left. Years later, he watched the Missing 411 documentary called Hunted on Amazon. As the map on the screen displayed clusters of disappearances across the Pacific Northwest, his stomach tightened. One of those clusters was directly beside the area where he and his family had camped that weekend, and immediately he thought of the abandoned campsite, the crushed cooler, the shredded tent, the propane tank smashed flat, the feeling of being watched, the dogs refusing to stand down. The rope tied years before his family arrived. He realized that whatever happened in those woods before they arrived might not have been an accident, and whatever caused it might still have been out there that day, less than 300 feet from where they slept. Alright guys, that will be it for today. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss next week's upload. I drop new stories every week, so there's always something coming. And if you want to boost the channel, tap the hype button too. I'll see you in the next one.